Sarah lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Seattle, where tall trees whispered through the windows and the rain often played background music to her lonely evenings. Her husband, Daniel, had left for yet another business trip that morning this time to Chicago, and the house already felt emptier without him. It wasn't just his absence that echoed through the rooms anymore, it was the emotional distance that had slowly crept in over the past 2 years. Daniel used to text her from the airport, send pictures from hotel lobbies, or call just to say goodnight. Now, there were only brief updates, dry conversations, and the occasional love you that sounded more like a habit than a feeling. That Friday evening, Sarah lit a lavender candle, folded warm laundry fresh from the dryer, and tried to fill the silence with music she used to love. But nothing seemed to quiet the ache in her chest. Just as she was reaching for a book, a soft knock came at the front door. It was unexpected, almost strange. No deliveries were scheduled, and it was well past the time neighbors usually dropped by. Curious but cautious, she padded to the door in her slippers, heart beating faster than she could explain. When she opened it, standing there in the golden porch light was Evan, her husband's best friend. But more than that, he was someone who had once been a constant in her life, before marriage, before responsibility, back when everything felt simple and unspoken emotions could still exist without names. Evan, she said, blinking in surprise. He looked both familiar and different. His hair was slightly damp from the rain, his coat open, his hands in his pockets. His smile was soft, hesitant, but warm in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hey," he said. "I was just passing through. Thought I'd check on you." Sarah's throat tightened. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. No one ever checked on her anymore. "You want to come in?" she asked, almost without thinking. "Only if it's okay," he said, his eyes meeting hers, and just like that, she stepped aside, letting him in, not just into the house, but into a moment neither of them had expected. The air felt warmer suddenly, heavier, as if something invisible had entered with him. They sat in the living room, not too close, not too far, the space between them filled with memories from a time long gone, college days, road trips, the way Evan used to make her laugh before life got complicated. As the fire crackled and the rain continued to fall, something inside Sarah stirred. It wasn't about physical attraction, not yet. It was about being seen, noticed, remembered. The tension was soft, not sharp like the edge of something that could become more if neither of them stepped away. Evan didn't say anything inappropriate. He didn't flirt, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something unspoken that settled between them like a secret waiting to be told. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in months, and, in that moment, Sarah realized it wasn't about betrayal. It was about connection, about longing for a feeling that had gone missing in her marriage for far too long. As Evan reached for the mug she handed him, their fingers touched briefly, and even that simple contact felt like a spark. She didn't know what would happen next, but her heart was no longer silent. The door had opened, and not just the one. At the front of the house, the soft glow of candlelight flickered across the walls as Evan sat on the edge of Sarah's couch, his posture respectful but unsure, like a man standing at the edge of a feeling he couldn't name. The storm outside had deepened, and the steady rhythm of rain tapping the windows became a kind of music in the background, something soft, something slow. Sarah placed 2 steaming mugs of tea on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly. though she told herself it was just the chill in the air. But the truth was heavier. She hadn't been alone with Evan in years, not like this. And never in this house. Never with this kind of silence between them. As she sat across from him, their eyes met not in a dramatic way, not cinematic, but in the honest, searching way two people do when there's history between them. And maybe something more. They began to talk, starting with the safe topics: weather, traffic, how Daniel was probably stuck in some boardroom on the 22nd floor of a glass hotel. But soon, their words slipped into deeper places. Evan asked her how she was really, not just fine or keeping busy, but how she felt. No one had asked her that in so long that the question landed like a warm hand on her chest. She hesitated, then opened up in a quiet voice, telling him how the days felt long, how her marriage had begun to feel more like a schedule than a relationship. "We don't fight," she said, "but we don't feel like us anymore either." Evan listened, really listened. His eyes didn't drift to his phone, and he didn't try to fix anything. He just sat there, taking her in like every word she spoke mattered. There was something undeniably comforting about his presence, familiar but different. He looked older than the boy she used to know, but his eyes still carried the same calm, steadiness that had once made her feel safe in crowded college parties and long drives home. As the conversation flowed, Sarah laughed, a real laugh that surprised even her, and Evan's face softened, the corners of his lips lifting as he watched her. "You still laugh the same," he said quietly. The compliment hit her somewhere deep, not because it was romantic, but because it was personal, real, noticing the details someone else had stopped seeing. The fire crackled, the candlelight danced, and the space between them grew smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Sarah caught herself studying the shape of his hands wrapped around his mug, the way his voice dipped when he said her name. There was no seduction, no obvious flirtation, but the tension was there, gentle, simmering, unspoken, a warmth that settled in her chest and spread down her arms. At one point, he looked at her just a second too long, and she felt her breath catch. Not out of fear but recognition, that quiet, trembling awareness of someone who once could have been something more, had life chosen differently. Evan finally said it softly. "You seem tired, Sarah. Not just tonight. Lately." She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked down and said, "I feel like I've been disappearing." His reply came without hesitation. "I see you." It was just 3 words, but they felt like the first real touch of the evening. They hung in the air between them like a truth neither of them had planned to speak. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but not afraid. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt seen, wanted not for what she did or who she was married to, but simply for being herself. And just like that, something quiet and dangerous began to bloom in the warmth between them. The clock ticked softly, but the silence between them was louder than ever. The storm outside had quieted, but inside the house, a different kind of tension had taken its place, gentle, warm, and dangerously real. Sarah stood by the kitchen sink, staring out into the wet darkness of her backyard, trying to steady her breath. She could still feel Evan's presence in the room behind her, even though he wasn't touching her. He hadn't moved closer, hadn't said anything inappropriate, but everything between them had shifted. She could feel it in her chest, in the way her heart beat too fast and her thoughts started slipping into places they weren't supposed to go. Her marriage wasn't bad, not on the surface, but that surface had thinned over time. The laughter had faded, the affection had cooled, And somewhere between Daniel's work trips and their polite dinners, something in Sarah had gone quietly numb. But now, just a few feet behind her, was a man who made her feel awake again. Not because he said the right words, but because he looked at her like he knew her. Evan's voice broke the silence, low and rough. "I should go," he said from across the room, but he didn't move. Sarah didn't turn around. Instead, she gripped the edge of the sink, feeling the war inside her between what was right and what she wanted. She wasn't sure anymore which voice she should listen to. Without thinking, she whispered, "You always leave." The words surprised her even as they left her lips. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession. Evan's footsteps came closer, slow and steady, until he was just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body without touching him. Her breath caught in her throat. "Sarah," he said, and there was something broken in the way he said her name. "If I stay, I'm not just staying for tea." The words hung in the air, thick and electric. Sarah turned then slowly and looked up into his eyes. What she saw wasn't lust, it was longing. Years of it. The kind you hide under friendship, under loyalty, under timing that was never quite right. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him how her heart ached, how confused she felt, how deeply she missed being wanted. But she didn't have to say it. He already knew. They stood there, hearts pounding, eyes locked, breathing the same air. Then he stepped back. It was the most respectful, painful thing he could have done. "I can't," Evan said gently. "Not like this, not tonight." And just like that, he turned and walked to the door. Sarah didn't stop him. She couldn't. If she asked him to stay, something irreversible would happen. He knew it. She knew it. So she stood there, frozen, as the door clicked open, then softly shut. But it didn't latch all the way. She noticed that, her heart still racing. It felt like a question left hanging. She walked to the doorway, standing in the dim light, one hand on the frame, staring into the night. Evan's car was still parked at the curb, his silhouette barely visible behind the fogged-up windshield. He hadn't driven away yet. In that moment, Sarah wasn't sure what hurt more, wanting him to come back in, or knowing he wouldn't unless she asked. What they had shared in those hours wasn't physical, but it had been deeply intimate. And now that it had happened, nothing felt the same. The line between friendship and something more had been crossed, not with a kiss, but with a feeling. One neither of them could take back. The next morning, Sarah woke early, even before the sun had fully risen. The house was quiet, as it always was when Daniel was away, but something inside her had changed. Sleep had come in fragments, short, restless moments filled with dreams she couldn't quite remember but still felt lingering in her chest. She lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, remembering the way Evan had stood behind her, close enough to feel his presence but far enough to stay respectful. He hadn't touched her, he hadn't kissed her, but the way he looked at her, the way he saw her, those things stayed with her, deeper than any physical moment could have reached. She kept thinking about the door, how it hadn't fully closed behind him, how it felt like a pause instead of an ending. It was as if a part of him had chosen to leave something open in case she needed him to come back. Later in the day, Daniel called from the airport. His voice was distant, tired. He talked about delays, gate changes, and how annoying the travel had been. Not once did he ask how she was. Not once did he ask how her night went or if she had slept okay. She told him she missed him, just to see if it would stir anything in him. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Yeah, me too," but it felt like a reflex, like someone replying without really hearing the words. When the call ended, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in her hand, and felt the truth settle in her chest. This wasn't the kind of love that made her feel alive anymore. It was the kind that made her feel small, unnoticed, alone in a partnership that looked fine on the outside but was slowly eroding from within. By the time evening arrived, the storm had passed, and the world outside was washed clean, green and fresh and full of quiet. Sarah walked out into the backyard barefoot, the grass still damp beneath her toes. The air smelled like rain and new beginnings. She looked up at the sky, where soft clouds drifted across fading light, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel exactly what she was feeling. No guilt, no second guessing. She wasn't thinking about right or wrong, only real, only honest. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she finally typed out a message to Evan. It was simple. "You didn't stay, but thank you for coming." She stared at the screen, wondering if she'd said too much or not enough. But before she could overthink it, the reply came in. "I didn't want to cross a line, but I'll come again if you ever ask." That was it. No pressure, no assumptions, just an open door, like the one he left behind last night. Sarah smiled, softly, the kind of smile that comes from being seen not as someone's wife, not as someone holding everything together, but as a woman who still has a heart, still has desire, still deserves to be loved deeply. As the sky turned gold and blue, she realized something important. Some storms don't tear things apart, they show you what was already broken. And sometimes, the person you think you shouldn't need is the one who reminds you what it feels like to want again. Sarah didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure. A part of her had come back to life, and whatever happened next, she wouldn't ignore it anymore. Because for the first time in a long time, her heart wasn't quiet. It was calling out for more.